Parliamentary Network on Illicit Financial Flows and Taxation Continental Conference is currently underway in Johannesburg, South Africa. The conference brings together parliamentarians, policymakers, as well as experts from across the continent to reflect on the progress that has been made and also to explore ways to strengthen Africa's fight against illicit financial flows. The event comes at the back of the just concluded 13th Pan-African Conference on Illicit Financial Flows and Taxation. You'll remember that we covered that quite extensively here on Africa in Business. But to turn our focus now once again to the Tax Justice Network Africa, which is TJNA'S Executive Director, Ms. Chenai Mukumba. Very good afternoon. Good to have you with us. Welcome.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
So what are the key progress that has been made by the African continent in tackling illicit financial flows over the past decade? I think just looking at the events that we've been having back to back, focusing specifically on tax justice, it shows just what a critical concern it is for the continent.
Yeah, so I would say there's three things, right? The first is that over the past 10 years, we've been able to really profile the magnitude and seriousness of the loss of illicit financial flows from the continent. So prior to the publication of the report we were celebrating last week, there was almost no recognition of the fact that as a continent, we were losing all of these resources. And it was primarily due to the practices of multinational corporations on the continent, right? So the first thing that the report did was flag this as a mainstream issue that we need to all address. The second is that it really started to get governments to think through what are some of the national reforms they need to take, right, in order to address the loss of resources. And so we started to see many governments strengthen their tax administrations, strengthen some of their legislation to make it more difficult, right, for private companies, private multinational enterprises to sort of funnel resources outside of the continent, resources that we could use for our development, right? And then the third sort of big success here was the way in which the Africa Group 2-3 years ago was able to start a conversation about how all countries must be involved in the development of tax rules at the international level, right? So right now we've got a small group of particularly wealthy countries that determine these rules and set rules that are quite difficult for African countries to meet, right? And so make us vulnerable to sort of abusive practices. And so this work by the Africa Group really has set us on a path to start to redefine the kinds of rules that govern the international tax system.
And how is APNIFT helping to turn political will into concrete action? Because, you know, the will can be there, but only when you actually act upon it are you able to make sizable changes.
So APNIFT is our sort of Pan-African continental network for members of parliament, right? And so one of the things that we saw as particularly important when thinking about addressing the loss of these resources was not just sort of the technical work that needs to be done, right? But the way in which our politicians were able to hold to account, right, all of these different actors. And so we've seen some of our active APNIFT national caucuses question their executives, right? So for example, what is your IFF strategy, right? Or are you participating in the global tax rules? Or this contract that you've signed with this large multinational company, to what extent is it going to truly benefit citizens as opposed to sort of see resources be funneled out? And so we've got many country case studies where you've seen this incredible work being done across the continent.
So if we look at the work that you are doing, right, and we look at APNIFT as well, and the just concluded 13th Pan-African Conference on Illicit Financial Flows and Taxation, do you find that there's a lot of duplication there of topic, of concepts, of resolutions, or is there a sense of progression from one conference to another, a sense of synergy perhaps?
So it's actually a sense of synergy. What we did with our Pan-African conference that we, sort of fondly call the PAC, is really use that as an opportunity to bring right to the forefront the importance of this conversation. And so it was incredible for us to have, a former president, Thabo Mbeki, join us, as well as some of the high-level panel members that were responsible of this work 10 years ago. And what we did in that conversation is sort of talk through what's happened, but also start to conceptualize what we want to do moving forward, right? So the audience of that particular conversation was civil society organizations, activists, academics, right? And some of these sort of high-level politicians that were part of that conversation. The meeting we're having this week, right, is now, so what next, right? We've had these conversations. Who are the people that are now going to take it to the level at which it begins to actually influence policy reform? So with this meeting, we're talking to members of parliament and saying, when you go back to your countries, right, off the back of conversations we've had last week and this week, ask these questions, right? Call these people to account, ask for these documents, right? So now this is actually where we're seeing the people with influence, right, begin to start the ball rolling in terms of action.
And that's the important part, the action after the resolutions, the action after the
Exactly.
conversations. Thank you very much, Chenai, for putting all of that into perspective. Maybe just throwing forward and looking forward, maybe for the rest of this year and early parts of 2026, what other, conferences or meetings are there going to be around the area of illicit financial flows and taxation that deal specifically on the African continent?
So the next big meeting that we're really trying to garner support and public awareness around is a meeting that's going to be taking place in November in Nairobi. And so, as I mentioned, right, some of the work that's been sort of spearheaded by the Africa Group is this discussion on reform of the global tax system. And what they're trying to do is see how we can shift where those conversations happen from the OECD, right, to the United Nations. And the thinking being here that at the UN, one country has one vote, regardless of size, right, regardless of economic development, we must be able to have a say. So in November, there is going to be over sort of a period of 2 weeks, a continuation of those negotiations, right? And so we're really encouraging African governments to make sure that they have one or two negotiators in those meetings, right, to influence that decision making, because we're actually seeing now the conversations that normally happen in New York happen in Nairobi on the African continent. And it's a real opportunity for us to push our agenda to curb IFFs.
Great progress there, because geography does matter. We thank you so much, Ms. Chenai Mukumba, for that.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. That was TJNA'S Executive Director, Chenai Mukumba, for the focus on illicit financial flows. And that meeting that's going to be taking place in November, also a very key one to tackle this challenge. It's gone exactly 4:30 p.m. Central African time. Let's take you now to the market desk, where Chanduko Legege is standing by with your latest market indicators.